So I've been working on a new bed for each of my two daughters. After we moved into the cabin, they both decided they wanted full-size beds. They needed new beds anyway, so we decided to upgrade them and get them full-size mattresses. And as a result, I'm building a couple of new beds for them. But one thing that I ran across that I'm sure a lot of you may have come across in the past is that when you're building something of this size, you often have a problem with clamps. The fact is you just don't have clamps that are long enough to clamp something this big. This headboard is roughly 56 inches wide, 57 inches wide, something like that. So I would need a 5-foot long clamp to clamp this, to clamp these rails and stiles together. The longest clamps that I have are only 4 feet. So what do? Well, you can go out and buy a whole bunch of new clamps. I'm building 2 headboards and I would need 3 per headboard at least. So for me to go out and buy 6 new clamps, 5, 6-foot clamps, that could be a pretty significant investment. If you use pipe clamps, sure, you could go out and just buy some longer pipe for the pipe clamp heads that you already have, but even that is going to cost you $20 to $30 per length of pipe. If you've got to buy 4, 5, 6 of those, you could be spending a couple $100 by the time you just buy the pipe to make those clamps longer. So what if most of your clamps are shorter and you really don't want to or can't afford to go out and buy a whole bunch of new clamps? What can you do to clamp large projects like this? I want to show you a couple of ways that you can utilize the clamps that you already have and extend their reach, essentially make them longer, extend their reach so that they can clamp larger objects. So one of the ways that you can essentially lengthen your clamps is to take 2 clamps and just hook them together. I'm just using little 6-inch ones here for demonstration, but you can actually hook the heads together and be able to extend the length of your clamp. You know, if you've got 2-footers or 3-footers, you could get a 4 or 6-foot clamp out of that. The one challenge with this though is that, as you can see, the heads can kind of get in the way with an F-style clamp like this. However, if you have parallel jaw clamps or pipe clamps, you can actually reverse the heads. So I can take this head off, flip it around, and now once I put the head back on, okay, now I can clamp up this way and I'm unencumbered down here. I have lots of free space. And you can either hook the heads together like so, or if that doesn't work for you, you can actually take a clamp and clamp the 2 heads together. And now you've got yourself a longer clamp. And this is actually one of the methods that I used to glue up one of the headboards. I took a couple of 4-foot and a 2-foot long parallel jaw clamp like this and just hooked them together or clamped them together and made a longer clamp that I was able to use to clamp that 5-foot headboard. Another little trick that I keep in my arsenal for times like these are ratchet straps. A lot of you probably already have these out in your truck somewhere. You can buy purpose-made band clamps, but why when these are essentially the same thing? With this, I can clamp almost completely around that 5-foot headboard. Unfortunately, one wasn't quite long enough, but that doesn't matter because if you need them longer, you can just hook 2 of them together and get yourself an even longer band clamp or ratchet clamp. Now, of course, this isn't extending the length of your existing clamps, but it is using something else instead of a clamp to do the same task. And I know a lot of you probably already have these laying around the house. So put them to use in your woodworking. They make fantastic long clamps. One of my favorite little tricks for clamping up really long stock is just to use a couple of really small clamps to essentially shorten the clamping distance. The way you do that is you take a couple of scrap blocks and a couple of small clamps and you clamp them to the long part. In the case of the bed, the headboard, it was the rails that were running between the posts of the headboard. So you clamp these small blocks to the headboard or to the rail with a couple of small clamps. Then you can take a couple of longer clamps, hook them onto the block that you clamped to your long section and to the other part where you need to draw the joint closed. In this case, I hooked them to the block and then to the leg or post of the headboard. And by doing that, I could use this little 12-inch clamp to pull together a headboard that was over 5 feet long. So that's a fantastic little trick if you have a bunch of little clamps in your shop, which most of us usually do, because these are, these short clamps, probably the 12-inch to 2-foot, maybe even some 3-footers are probably the most used clamps in the shop. I probably use my 2-footers and 3-footers the most when it comes to casework and assembly of tables and things like that. But for smaller projects, 6 and 12s, you use a ton of them. And most people have a lot of them. And that's a great little way to use the small clamps that you have and still allow you to clamp up some really big stuff. So there's just a few ways that you can use the smaller clamps that you have to clamp up larger stuff. Of course, there are other ways as well. You could go out and buy new clamps, of course, and don't let me stop you from doing that. You can use Spanish windlass in certain situations, which is essentially like the toggle that you see in a bow saw with a string and a stick, and you twist the rope up. That can be used in some situations. Sometimes you don't have room, or there might be a panel or something that blocks you from twisting up the stick, so that may or may not work for you, but it's another option that you can try. You can also make a large clamp very easy with nothing more than a dowel, a couple 2x4s, and a couple scraps of wood. Essentially, take those 2x4s, drill a hole in them that you can put the dowel through. Put one dowel on either end and use wedges slipped between the dowel and your workpiece to wedge everything up and tighten up the joint. And that's a real cheap homemade clamp that you can make in just about any size. I've used them before. I didn't use them on this headboard project because I had these other methods at hand. But again, that's a really great way that you can make your own long clamps just from some scrap wood for pennies, pennies a piece. So, another way that you can make long clamps or clamp up long stuff without having to go out and spend $60, $70, $80 on some really long, heavy duty clamps. So I hope those tips will help some of you out there, and we'll see you next time.